A great civilization does not simply vanish all at once. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, a network of powerful empires connected the ancient world from Greece to Egypt. Kings exchanged letters and gifts, traders moved copper and luxury goods across vast distances, and mighty cities thrived. Then, within a few generations, that glittering world shattered. Yet the collapse tells a deeper, more puzzling story. It was not a uniform darkness. While legendary capitals like Hattusa and Ugarit were abandoned forever, other settlements just over the horizon not only survived, they eventually flourished. Why would an entire city be left empty while life continued nearby? By the end of this exploration, you will understand the fragile architecture of civilization itself and why complexity can be the ultimate liability. We will uncover why some communities weathered a storm that obliterated their mighty neighbors, leaving behind only silent stones and unanswered questions. What does it take for a society to truly endure? This was a world held together by a delicate web of promises and precious metals. Across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, great powers had learned to talk rather than fight endlessly. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the new kingdom of Egypt along the Nile, the Mycenaean palaces in Greece, and the rising power of Assyria in Mesopotamia, they all operated within a shared system of international relations. Kings addressed each other as brother in formal letters, like those found at Amarna in Egypt, negotiating marriages, trading gifts of gold and ivory, and appealing for shipments of vital materials. The most critical of these was tin, the essential alloy that, when mixed with copper, created bronze. Copper might come from Cyprus, tin from far-off Afghanistan, and the finished weapons or tools might end up in a Hittite armory or an Egyptian workshop. This was globalization in its most ancient form, a network of elite exchange that created unprecedented wealth and stability. But this stability came with a hidden cost, a profound interdependence. A disruption in the tin trade could paralyze kingdoms. A diplomatic fallout between royal brothers could halt the flow of grain or military aid. The entire system functioned like a finely balanced mobile, where touching one piece made every other piece tremble. For generations, the mobile held its shape, glittering and impressive. Then, a series of shocks began to hit, not just one piece but several at once. The very connections that had been the source of its strength were about to become channels for its collapse. The mobile began to swing violently around the year 1225 before the Common Era. This was the collapse event horizon, a roughly 75-year window where the synchronized failure of this interconnected system left an unmistakable scar in the archaeological record. It was not a slow fading, but a rapid series of fractures. In Anatolia, the magnificent Hittite capital of Hattusa, a city of grand temples and fortified walls, was not just conquered but systematically abandoned. Its gates were left open, its archives buried, and its people simply walked away, never to return. Across the Aegean Sea, the great Mycenaean palace centers met a fiery end. At Pylos, tablets baked in the inferno that destroyed the administrative heart of the kingdom. At Mycenae itself, the mighty Lion Gate stood guard over a citadel reduced to ash and silence. On the coast of modern-day Syria, the bustling port city of Ugarit, a critical hub in the international trade network, sent out desperate final letters. One found in its kiln pleaded for help from a neighboring king, reporting that enemy ships were already sighted and their own forces were away. The city was sacked and burned, its wealth looted, its docks empty. Even the seemingly unshakable new kingdom of Egypt reeled, losing its grip on distant territories and struggling with internal strife, its power diminishing from an empire to a kingdom focused on survival. The evidence for this rupture is stark and physical. archaeologists find a clear destruction layer, a band of ash and collapsed masonry that separates the age of palaces from the age that followed. Workshops that once produced fine pottery and bronze weapons fall silent. The flow of luxury goods, the intricate jewelry and carved ivory that marked elite status, ceases abruptly. This was a sharp break, a severing of the old ways. The complex system of specialized labor, long-distance exchange, and centralized authority that defined the Bronze Age world simply stopped functioning in countless places. Yet as the dust settled, a puzzling pattern emerged from the ruins. Not every light went out, but in the midst of this widespread silence, other voices kept speaking. While the great empires crumbled, a handful of communities not only survived the crisis, they laid the groundwork for the next age. Along the coast of what is now Lebanon, the cities of Byblos and Sidon endured. These were the early Phoenician centers, and they would soon become legendary sailors and traders in their own right. Far to the east, the Assyrian heartland in Upper Mesopotamia, though shaken, did not break. Its core cities remained occupied, a continuity of power that would eventually fuel a new imperial giant. On the island of Cyprus, archaeological evidence shows that while some major centers were damaged, life and trade did not cease entirely. And in the hill country of Canaan, away from the crumbling coastal city-states, new forms of society were taking root, groups that would later be identified as early Israelites and Philistines. This is the Survivor Anomaly, the critical counter-evidence that makes the Bronze Age collapse not just a tragedy, but a profound historical puzzle. If the collapse was a universal catastrophe, why did these specific places weather the storm? What invisible shields did they possess that the mighty Hittite capital or the wealthy port of Ugarit lacked? The answer lies not in their strength but in their structure. To understand why some cities were abandoned, we must look at what made the survivors different. The difference between a city that fell and one that stood may have begun with the sky. Beneath the grand politics and glittering trade, every Bronze Age civilization rested on a single, vulnerable foundation, the annual harvest. Modern science now reveals that this foundation was cracking. Paleoclimatologists, scientists who study ancient weather, have uncovered a stark truth from unlikely archives. The growth rings of ancient juniper trees preserved in Anatolia tell a story of shrinking rainfall. Sediments pulled from the bottom of lakes in Greece and Israel show layers of dust, indicating periods of extreme dryness. Stalagmites from caves in the region, which grow slowly from dripping water, preserve chemical signatures of a parched atmosphere. Together, this evidence paints an undeniable picture. A prolonged and severe period of drought gripped the eastern Mediterranean world right at the time of the collapse. This was not a single bad season, but a mega-drought, a climatic shift that may have lasted for decades. Imagine the slow, relentless pressure of that. A kingdom's grain stores, built to last a year or two, are slowly depleted as harvest after harvest fails. The water levels in vital springs and rivers drop, making the elaborate irrigation channels built by kings run dry. Herds of cattle and sheep, the walking wealth of the age, dwindle as pastures turn to dust. This climatic shift was the great stressor, a foundational crisis that placed every society under immense and unrelenting strain. It did not cause the collapse by itself, but it loaded the system with a weight it was never designed to bear. A famine is more than just hunger, it is a social earthquake. It shatters the basic contract between a ruling elite and the people they govern. When a king can no longer provide bread, his divine mandate to rule evaporates. When a farmer cannot feed his family, his loyalty to a distant palace fades. The mega-drought turned the landscape of prosperity into a landscape of scarcity, and in that harsh new world, the complex, interconnected systems of the Bronze Age began to look less like a network of strength and more like a web of fatal dependencies. Into this landscape of failing harvests and fraying loyalties sailed a new and terrifying force. The pharaohs of Egypt left us their testimony, carved in stone and written on papyrus, describing waves of invaders from the sea. At the great temple of Medinet Habu, built by Ramesses III, vast reliefs show a chaotic naval battle, with Egyptian forces fighting fiercely against an array of distinctive warriors. These enemies are not a single nation, but a confederation, listed by names that still echo with mystery: the Peleset, the Shekelesh, the Denyon, the Weshesh, and others. They arrived, the inscriptions declare, with their families and possessions loaded on ox carts and ships, a people on the move. Another document, the Papyrus Harris, states plainly that these groups had laid waste to great lands, that not one stood before them. For over a century, these sea peoples have been cast as the primary villains of the Bronze Age collapse, the barbarian horde that swept in and burned the civilized world to the ground. But modern historians see a more complex and revealing story. The sea peoples were likely not a cause, but a catastrophic symptom. They were the human wave created by the perfect storm of drought, famine, and systemic failure. Imagine coastal communities whose fields had turned to dust, or populations living in the shadow of collapsing empires, their trade routes severed and their protectors gone. These were people with nothing left to lose, bands of the displaced, the desperate, and the opportunistic, coalescing into mobile fighting forces. They moved along the coasts, the lifelines of the ancient world, because that is where the remaining wealth was concentrated, in the storerooms of ports and palace towns already weakened from within. They did not attack from a position of strength, but from a position of necessity. Their terrifying effectiveness was a multiplier of the existing collapse, accelerating the fall of cities that were already on the brink. The fate of these groups is as mysterious as their origins. Some, like the Peleset, are widely believed to have eventually settled along the coast of Canaan, becoming the Philistines of biblical fame. Others simply vanish from the historical record, absorbed into the shifting populations of the New Age. They were less an invading army and more a human manifestation of the era's chaos, a clear sign that the old order could no longer hold its people or defend its shores. Their story shifts the question from who destroyed the Bronze Age world to what forces could create such desperate, mobile destroyers in the first place. The true weakness of the great empires lay not in their walls but in their wallets. At the heart of the Hittite and Mycenaean worlds was a system known as the palatial economy. Everything of value flowed toward the central palace, a vast administrative machine. Royal scribes tracked every jar of oil, every bolt of cloth, and every ingot of bronze. In return for their labor or military service, people received rations and goods redistributed from the palace storehouses. This was a world of meticulous lists and total dependency. The king was not just a ruler, he was the ultimate provider. His legitimacy rested on his ability to keep that complex machine humming, to ensure the grain ships arrived and the bronze smiths had metal to work. It was a brilliant system for concentrating wealth and power, but it was breathtakingly fragile. All its vital connections ran through a single, vulnerable hub. When the climate shifted and harvests began to fail, the palace's storehouses emptied. When the international trade networks faltered, the essential shipments of tin and luxury goods stopped arriving. The machine seized up. Suddenly, the king could not fulfill his most basic promise to provide for his people. The social contract woven over centuries snapped. What would you do if the central authority that fed your family could no longer do so? You would stop looking to the palace and start looking out for yourself. We see evidence of this internal unraveling in the archaeological record. In some Mycenaean centers, there are signs of small, localized fires and violence within the citadel walls before the final destruction, hinting at internal strife or rebellion. In the Hittite Empire, outlying provinces began to stop sending their taxes and goods to the struggling capital. effectively going their own way as the center lost its grip. This was a collapse from within, a loss of faith that made kingdoms hollow long before any enemy reached their gates. Their complex, top-heavy systems became their own tombs. Yet, in the shadows of these falling giants, other models of life persisted. In the highlands and along some coastlines, societies were organized differently. Their economies were less centralized, built more on herding, diversified farming, and local trade networks that did not rely on a single palace's command. If one village had a bad harvest, another might still have surplus. If a trade route closed, local crafts could adapt using more readily available materials. These were not impressive, glittering states, but they were resilient, like reeds that bend in a storm where a mighty oak will splinter. This crucial difference in social and economic architecture begins to answer our core mystery. It was not necessarily about who was strongest when times were good, but about who was most adaptable when everything fell apart. The survivors were not always the most powerful, they were often the most flexible. And as the old world burned, that flexibility would become the blueprint for an entirely new age. A brilliant civilization can become a prisoner of its own design. The splendor of Hattusa or Mycenae was built upon a foundation of deep specialization. Think of the bronze smith, a master of his craft. He did not mine his own copper, nor did he travel to distant lands to barter for tin. His materials arrived through a long and delicate chain, managed by royal merchants and protected by diplomatic treaties. The scribe who recorded the palace's wealth wrote on clay tablets using a complex script he alone could read, his entire purpose tied to administering that centralized system. The farmer, often working land owned by the palace, grew specific crops for the state storehouses, relying on the king's redistribution for his own family's grain, oil, and clothing. This was a world of profound interdependence, where every person played a highly specific role in a machine they could not control. For generations, this machine produced wonders, from intricate gold jewelry to chariots fitted with the latest bronze weaponry. It created stability, culture, and immense power. But this intricate system had a fatal flaw: it could not simplify. When the drought withered the fields and the sea peoples disrupted the sea lanes, the machine began to break down. The tin shipment stopped. The smith, for all his skill, could not make bronze without tin. His specialized knowledge was suddenly worthless. The scribes meticulously kept records, documented a dwindling reality, a countdown to emptiness. The farmer, facing a failed harvest, had no personal reserve to fall back on. His survival was literally stored in the palace granary, which was now running low. There was no easy way to go back. How does a society that has forgotten how to be self-sufficient remember in time? The complex bureaucracy, the very thing that allowed for such concentrated wealth, became a barrier to adaptation. It was like a magnificent clock that could only tell one kind of time, and when the world changed, its gears simply locked. They could not abandon their cities and become subsistence farmers overnight. That knowledge and those social structures had faded over centuries of comfortable reliance. The cities were not just attacked from the outside, they were paralyzed from within by their own sophistication. Their success had made them fragile. Meanwhile, the communities that survived often had economies that were less specialized, more flexible. They knew how to herd goats in the hills, how to grow a mix of crops, how to make tools from local iron rather than distant tin. When the great networks failed, they simply tightened their local circles and carried on. The collapse, therefore, was a brutal filter. It did not punish weakness in the traditional sense, it punished inflexibility. The greatest cities of the age were ultimately abandoned not because they were poor, but because they were too rich, too complex, and too connected to a world that had ceased to exist. The fate of the Hattusa offers a perfect illustration of this fatal rigidity. Perched on a rocky plateau in central Anatolia, the Hittite capital was a masterpiece of imperial power, a city of cyclopean stone walls, grand processional gates, and vast subterranean grain silos designed to withstand a siege. Yet when archaeologists uncovered it, they found a profound mystery. There was no great layer of ash, no evidence of a final, sacking battle. Instead, the city appeared to have been deliberately and peacefully abandoned. Its gates were carefully sealed shut from the inside. The royal archives, thousands of clay tablets detailing laws, treaties, and rituals, were neatly stored in their rooms. It was as if the entire population simply walked away, locking the door behind them. This orderly departure is more chilling than any scene of destruction. It suggests a slow, grim realization that the city itself, for all its grandeur, was no longer viable. The empire's lifeblood had stopped flowing. The Hittite state was a giant with a fragile heart. Its Anatolian homeland was rocky and prone to drought, unable to produce enough grain to feed its own administrative and military elite. The empire's survival depended on a constant influx of food from fertile, subordinate regions to the south and east, and on its absolute control over the trade routes that brought in vital metals. When the Mega-Drought struck, those fertile regions could no longer send surplus grain. They needed every kernel for themselves. Simultaneously, the collapse of trade networks with Cyprus and beyond cut off the supply of copper and tin. The central authority in Hattusa, the brain of this vast body, found itself starved of both bread and bronze. The social contract evaporated. Outlying provinces, seeing no aid coming from the capital, stopped sending taxes and troops. The mighty Hittite king, once called the Sun, could no longer fulfill his most basic role as provider and protector. In the end, the people did not flee an enemy army, they fled a broken system. They migrated to smaller, more defensible sites, like the city of Tarhantassa in the south, places where local resources and simpler organization offered a better chance of survival. The great capital was not conquered, it was simply rendered obsolete, a magnificent clock tower in a world that had lost all sense of time. Meanwhile, on the sun-drenched Greek mainland, a similar story of systemic failure was reaching its fiery conclusion. Across the Peloponnese, the great Mycenaean palace centers, from Pylos to Mycenae to Turin, all burned within a remarkably short span of time. The archaeological record is stark and uniform, a thick layer of ash and collapsed masonry sealing the glory of an age. But unlike Hattusa's quiet abandonment, the end here feels frantic, charged with a last-minute desperation. At Mycenae, hordes of precious items were hastily hidden by inhabitants who never returned to reclaim them. Near the mighty citadel of Turin, workers desperately fortified access to a vital underground spring, a clear preparation for a siege they feared was coming. These were not the actions of a society taken by complete surprise, but of one sensing a gathering storm, battening down hatches against a threat it ultimately could not withstand. The nature of that threat, however, was as much internal as external. This was a classic systems collapse where the failure of one critical component caused the entire intricate machine to seize and shatter. The Mycenaean world was utterly dependent on its palatial centers. The palace was the brain, the bank, and the warehouse of the kingdom. Its scribes used a script we call Linear B to track every asset, from chariot wheels to flocks of sheep, for the purpose of taxation and redistribution. When the palace at Pylos burned, those clay tablets were accidentally fired, preserving for us a snapshot of a hyper-specialized economy in its final days. The tablets mention bronze smiths who are owed specific amounts of metal, textile workers assigned precise quotas of wool, and rowers being mustered for a coastal watch. Every person had a designated role, and every product flowed through the palace. When the interconnected Mediterranean trade networks fractured due to drought and unrest, the palace's ability to import vital goods like tin and ivory evaporated. When local harvests failed, the grain in the palace storehouses, meant to feed the specialists and soldiers, ran low. the entire logic of the system broke down. Why would a bronze smith work for a palace that could no longer provide him metal? Why would a farmer send his meager harvest to a central authority that could offer nothing in return? The social contract dissolved. The specialized knowledge that made the civilization brilliant, from writing linear B to inlaying fine weapons, suddenly had no practical value in a world that could no longer support such complexity. The loss of writing is particularly telling. It wasn't banned or forgotten in an instant, it simply ceased to be useful. When the administrative system that required it vanished, the script vanished with it, a silent testament to a way of life that had ended. In the aftermath, the survivors did not rebuild the palaces. Instead, they did something far more revealing. They moved. Populations retreated from the vulnerable, wealth-displaying coastal plains and valleys to more isolated, easily defended hilltops. They shifted from a complex, import-dependent economy to a simpler, localized one focused on herding and subsistence farming. The glittering, interconnected world of the Mycenaean palaces was gone, replaced by smaller, tighter communities whose priority was resilience, not grandeur. The burning of the palaces was not merely an attack, it was the final, catastrophic symptom of a system that had already eaten its own foundations. The survivors chose a different path, one of simplification, turning their backs on the very complexity that had once made them great. The final moments of a great city were recorded in clay. At the bustling port of Ugarit, on the coast of what is now Syria, scribes pressed their styluses into damp tablets, sending urgent pleas for help. One letter recovered from the ruins was addressed to the king of Alashiya on Cyprus. It reads with a chilling immediacy, "The enemy's ships are already here," it states. "They have set fire to my towns and have done very great damage." The letter ends with a desperate, telling admission. "Our own forces," it says, "are all stationed with the Hittite fleet, and all my own ships are still in Lycia." Ugarit, one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan hubs of the entire Bronze Age, was caught utterly defenseless. Its fate is a stark lesson in the perils of hyper-specialization and interconnectedness. This was a city that lived and died by the sea. Its wealth came not from vast farmlands, but from its position as a critical middleman in the international trade network. Ugariti merchants brokered deals between the Hittites to the north, the Egyptians to the south, and the kingdoms across the Mediterranean. Its scribes were so vital they developed their own simplified alphabet, a precursor to our own, to keep up with the volume of commercial and diplomatic correspondence. The city's economy was a masterpiece of efficiency, but it was built on a single, fragile premise that the sea lanes would always be open and that its powerful allies would always answer its call. Its location on a fertile coastal plain, perfect for receiving ships, was also its greatest vulnerability, offering no natural defenses against a threat from the water. When the systemic collapse began, Ugarit's strengths inverted with terrifying speed. The Hittite Empire, its primary protector, was crumbling inward, unable to send the requested fleet. The trade routes that were its lifeblood became highways for the desperate and the predatory, the very sea peoples its letter describes. With its own military away and its allies silent, the city was a jewel left unguarded. The archaeological evidence confirms the written desperation. Ugarit was not just sacked, it was systematically destroyed and then abandoned forever. The vibrant streets, archives, and workshops were reduced to a layer of ash. Unlike Hattusa, there was no orderly retreat, only a violent end. Ugarit's story is the ultimate case study of a node in a network. When the network was healthy, the node thrived beyond imagination. But when the network failed, that same node, specialized and dependent, was the first to be excised. It had put all its faith in a system of distant promises, and when those promises evaporated, so did the city's reason for being. But one great power refused to follow the script of total collapse. Far to the east, in the rain-fed plains of Upper Mesopotamia, the Assyrian Empire endured. While its western rivals like the Hittites vanished into history, Assyria, though severely shaken and reduced in territory, held its core together. It did not just survive the catastrophe, it absorbed the lessons of the age and would later explode back onto the world stage as a ruthless imperial giant. Its survival is the critical exception that proves the rule, a living laboratory showing what it took to weather the storm. So what did Assyria have that others did not? The first advantage was literally foundational, its geography. The Assyrian heartland was centered on the Tigris River and its tributaries, in an area that receives more reliable rainfall than the arid coasts of Syria or the rocky plateau of Anatolia. While the Mega-Drought was widespread, its effects were not uniform. Paleoclimate data suggests the eastern reaches of the Near East, while still facing hardship, may have been spared the very worst of the aridity that crippled the Mediterranean kingdoms. This meant Assyrian agriculture, while stressed, did not face total systemic failure. Fields could still produce, and herds could still find pasture, providing a crucial buffer of food security that starving empires to the west simply did not have. A state cannot fight for its survival on an empty stomach, and Assyria's geography gave it just enough to keep fighting. Its second shield was its structure. From its earliest days, Assyria was a state forged in constant conflict, with a deeply militarized culture and society. Its kings were not just administrators or distant gods, they were first and foremost war leaders, constantly campaigning to secure borders, punish rivals, and seize resources. This created a state that was inherently resilient, organized for mobilization and survival under pressure. When crisis hit, Assyria did not have to invent a new way to defend itself, it simply intensified its core function. Its armies were a permanent, professional instrument of the crown, not a collection of disparate forces from faltering vassals. This centralized military command allowed for a more coherent and rapid response to threats, both internal and external. Furthermore, Assyria's location placed it strategically east of the main theaters of chaos. The primary paths of the Sea People's devastating raids were along the Anatolian and Levantine coasts and across the eastern Mediterranean. Assyria was insulated from these direct naval assaults by hundreds of miles of land. Even more importantly, it was shielded by the very collapse of its neighbors. The mighty Hittite Empire to the west had long acted as a buffer, absorbing pressure from nomadic groups and rival kingdoms. When Hattusa fell, that buffer disappeared, but the chaos that followed primarily consumed the regions immediately surrounding the former Hittite lands. Assyria watched from a distance as the storm spent its fury on others, giving it precious time to fortify and regroup. It faced its own pressures, of course, from migrating Aramean tribes and rival Babylonian kings, but these were threats it understood and was structurally designed to confront. Assyria's story shows that survival was not about luck, but about a confluence of defensive advantages, a more resilient geography, a society built for endurance, and the grim fortune of watching the fire burn your neighbor's house first. It held the seeds of the future within its hardened core, waiting for the world to become quiet enough for its ambition to rise again. While empires crumbled, a different kind of power learned to bend with the wind. Along a narrow strip of the Levantine coast, the cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos faced the same storms that sank Ugarit and crippled the Hittites. Yet they did not just endure, they emerged stronger, becoming the legendary Phoenicians whose ships would redefine the ancient world. Their secret was a masterclass in adaptation, a complete reorientation of their very purpose. Unlike the great inland empires, these coastal cities were never truly self-sufficient in food. Their fertile hinterlands were limited and vulnerable to the same droughts. Their survival had always depended on trade, but when the old imperial trade networks shattered, they pivoted with breathtaking agility. They stopped waiting for caravans from Hattusa or gifts from Pharaoh and looked instead to the open sea. They shifted from being way stations in a land-based system to becoming the system itself, pioneering direct maritime commerce across the Mediterranean. This was a move from complexity to a new, more resilient kind of simplicity. Their economy streamlined around portable, high-value goods. They became famed for a unique purple dye extracted from sea snails, a luxury so potent it became synonymous with royalty. They mastered glassmaking and woodworking, with the famed cedars of Lebanon providing the perfect timber for their ships. These were goods that did not spoil, that held immense value in small quantities, and that could be loaded directly from workshop to ship, bypassing the dangerous, collapsing overland routes entirely. Their geography, which might have seemed a liability, became their ultimate defense. Tyre, famously, was originally built on an island just off the coast, while Sidon and Byblos were situated on easily defensible promontories. When threats loomed from the inland chaos or from raiders along the shore, they could pull back behind their walls and sever the connecting causeways, becoming virtual islands. The sea, which brought danger, also brought escape and opportunity. Their world was not the vast, vulnerable hinterland of a Hittite king, but the deck of a ship and the next safe harbor. This maritime focus freed them from the fatal dependency on a single agricultural base. A failed harvest inland was a crisis for an empire, but for Tyre, it was a reason to sail farther, to trade their dyes and glass for grain from Egypt or Sicily. Their resilience was built on mobility and optionality. They were not tied to one source of wealth or one protector. Their loyalty was to commerce and survival, which made them pragmatists in an age of dying ideologies. The collapse of the Bronze Age superpowers did not destroy their market, it simply removed the middlemen. In the quiet that followed the Great Fires, these cities found their moment. With the old imperial fleets gone and the seas open, they began a period of expansion that would define the next age. They planted trading posts and colonies from Cyprus to Sardinia to the coast of North Africa, including the settlement that would become Carthage. This was not conquest in the old imperial sense, but a network of connected ports, a new and more flexible web of exchange. The Phoenician survival, therefore, was no accident. It was the direct result of a society that chose adaptation over monument, that found strength in what the collapsing empires had neglected, the sea. Their story completes our understanding of the Great Filter. In the ashes of the Bronze Age, the future did not belong to those who were largest, but to those who could most swiftly reinvent their relationship with the world. The island of Cyprus tells a different story of the collapse, one of transformation rather than termination. While the great mainland empires were being erased, this large island in the eastern Mediterranean faced a violent and turbulent chapter, yet emerged with its core identity intact. At sites like Komi, a major urban and metallurgical center on the east coast, archaeologists find the familiar, sobering signature of the age, a destruction layer of ash and burned debris. The city was sacked and burned, likely by the same seaborne raiders that ravaged Ugarit. But here, the story does not end with permanent abandonment. Instead, the population did something remarkable. They simply moved. The focus of power and settlement shifted a short distance inland to a new site, modern-day Salamis, a location easier to defend and with better access to fresh water. This was not a disappearance, it was a strategic relocation, a pragmatic adaptation to a more dangerous world. Cyprus survived because it possessed something the collapsing empires desperately needed but could no longer securely access: copper. The island's very name is derived from this metal, and its rich ore deposits were the engine of its economy. Even as political orders crumbled, the demand for copper, the essential component of bronze, did not vanish. It simply entered a new, less formalized market. Cyprus adapted by becoming a metallurgical hub for a fractured world, supplying metal to whoever could trade for it, from surviving Phoenician ports to emerging powers in the Levant. This economic resilience was bolstered by a profound demographic shift. The island became a sanctuary, absorbing waves of refugees from the chaos. Archaeological evidence, particularly in pottery styles and burial practices, shows a clear influx of people from the Aegean world, likely survivors from the fallen Mycenaean palaces. These were not invaders but displaced communities seeking stability. They brought new skills, technologies, and cultural practices, which blended with the existing Cypriot traditions. This fusion did not destroy Cypriot society, it transformed and reinvigorated it. The old hierarchical systems softened, giving way to a new social order that was more localized and flexible. The script used on the island, a syllabic system known as Cypro-Minoan, evolved and persisted, a thread of continuity in a time of rupture. Cyprus demonstrates that collapse is not a binary switch between existence and oblivion. It is a spectrum of response. The island endured the fire but used the heat to forge a new identity. It traded the vulnerability of a coastal emporium for the security of a fortified inland center. It exchanged rigid old alliances for a pragmatic, open-door policy to trade and new people. Its story is one of resilience through essential utility and intelligent absorption. While grand capitals turned to silent stone, the copper mines of Cyprus kept ringing, and that sound guided a society through the dark into a new dawn. The human tide of the collapse had a name, but it had many faces. The movements we call the Sea Peoples were not a single army with a single flag, but a cascading effect of desperation set in motion by failing harvests and falling kingdoms. Imagine a farmer in the Aegean watching his olive trees wither and his grain parch in the field for the third straight year. The local Mycenaean lord can offer no aid, his own storerooms are empty, and his authority is crumbling. With no food and no future at home, the only option is movement. This farmer, along with his family and neighbors, packs what they can carry onto carts and small boats. They become part of a growing stream of the displaced, pushed from their homelands in Anatolia, the Aegean Islands, and perhaps even southern Europe by the same climatic pressures that were starving the great empires. They were not born raiders, they were made refugees by a changing world. Their journey was a search for survival, not conquest. But when this stream of hungry, uprooted people reached the shores of still-functioning states, it became an existential crisis. A complex kingdom like the Hittites or the city-state of Ugarit operated on a precise logistical calculus. They had calculated the grain needed to feed their population, the capacity of their ports, and the strength of their garrison walls. Their entire system was built for managing predictable flows of goods, of information, of a known number of subjects. What it could not handle was a sudden, unpredictable influx of thousands of strangers. These waves of migrants did not arrive with formal declarations of war. They arrived with immediate, overwhelming need. They needed food, water, and land immediately. A centralized state, already straining under drought and failing supply lines, had no bureaucratic mechanism to process, feed, or integrate such a surge. Its response was often paralysis, followed by violent rejection. The defensive walls meant to keep armies out became barriers that turned a humanitarian disaster into a military confrontation. The migrants, denied entry and facing starvation, had no choice but to fight for what they needed, transforming from desperate families into a formidable, chaotic fighting force. Their very movement became a weapon of mass disruption, shattering the fragile logistical chains of the old order. Yet this disruptive power met a different reception elsewhere. Smaller, less centralized communities along the Levantine coast and in the highlands often lacked the rigid bureaucracy that caused larger states to seize up. Their societies were more fluid, their economies based on herding and flexible farming that could, to a degree, absorb extra hands. While they certainly faced conflict, they also had a greater capacity for pragmatic integration. There is archaeological evidence along the Canaanite coast of new, distinct styles of pottery, architecture, and burial practices appearing right after the collapse, styles linked to Aegean origins. This suggests that some groups of these displaced people were not just destroying, but eventually settling, being absorbed into the local fabric. A large, complex state saw a refugee wave as a systemic threat to its delicate balance. A smaller, more agile society could sometimes see it as a source of new labor, new warriors, or new cultural practices. The difference in response determined who was overwhelmed and who found a way to endure the human storm. The great migrations of the era were both a symptom of the collapse and a final, decisive blow to those who could not bend. They reveal that a civilization's ultimate test may not be its wealth or its military might, but its capacity for compassion and adaptation in the face of another's desperation. A king's most terrifying weapon could become his heaviest burden. The ultimate symbol of Bronze Age military power was the chariot, a light, fast platform carrying a driver and an archer or spearman, often clad in gleaming bronze armor. These were not mere carts, they were the tanks of the ancient world, requiring immense investment and a complex support system. Each chariot needed a team of specially bred and trained horses, a skilled craftsman to maintain its delicate wooden and leather construction, and a steady supply of bronze for the fittings and the warrior's panoply. An empire's chariot corps was a direct reflection of its economic health, a glittering, mobile display of wealth and technological mastery. But when the palace economies began to starve, this magnificent force revealed its fatal vulnerability. The specialized supply chains that fed the chariot armies were the first to break. Tin for bronze became scarce or vanished entirely. Grain to feed the elite warhorses could no longer be spared from dwindling stores. The highly trained crews, dependent on royal rations, found their loyalty strained as those rations shrank. The very thing that had secured an empire's borders became a luxury it could no longer afford, a drain on resources at the precise moment every resource was needed for bare survival. The cost of defense was bankrupting the states it was meant to protect. Meanwhile, the nature of the threat was changing. The chaotic bands of raiders and migrants moving across the landscape did not fight in the orderly, chariot-dominated battles of the old royal annals. They fought as loose groups of infantry, often with simpler weapons, attacking vulnerable points, raiding supply lines, and melting into the hills. Against this kind of diffuse, unpredictable pressure, a magnificent chariot force was like using a sledgehammer to swat a swarm of flies, expensive, exhausting, and ultimately ineffective. The grand fortifications that had defined cities like Mycenae and Hattusa faced a similar paradox. Their towering cyclopean walls were engineering marvels, designed to withstand a formal siege by a rival king's army. But they were also static, demanding a large garrison for defense and tying the population to a single, conspicuous location. In an era of systemic collapse, a fortress can become a trap. If the countryside can no longer supply it, if the water sources outside the walls are cut off or poisoned, those mighty stones simply encircle a slow decline. The survivors in this new world learned to fight and defend differently. They could not afford the chariots overhead, so they invested in the individual infantrymen, armed with cheaper, more readily available weapons, perhaps even experimenting with early iron, a metal that did not rely on vanishing tin supplies. They traded the monumental citadel for defensible hilltops or easily evacuated coastal strongholds like the Phoenician cities. Most importantly, they understood the power of alliance over central command. Smaller communities banded together in loose confederations for mutual defense, a network that could not be decapitated by the fall of a single capital. A group of villages agreeing to light signal fires or muster a shared militia was far more resilient and adaptable than a single palace trying to control a vast territory with a starving, overstretched army. The military lesson of the collapse was brutal in its simplicity. The tools of imperial dominance in a time of profound scarcity became liabilities. The future belonged not to those who could display the most impressive force, but to those who could field the most sustainable one. A state's power was written in bronze. The gleaming metal that armored kings, tipped spears, and secured the wheels of chariots was not a simple element pulled from the ground. It was an ancient alloy, a marriage of two metals from opposite ends of the known world. Copper was relatively plentiful, mined in places like Cyprus and the mountains of Anatolia. But tin, the magic ingredient that transformed soft copper into hard, resilient bronze, was extraordinarily rare. The most reliable sources lay thousands of miles apart, in the distant highlands of Afghanistan, and perhaps later, as far west as Cornwall in Britain. Think about that for a moment. To equip a single Hittite army, the king's merchants had to orchestrate a logistical miracle, coordinating the safe passage of tin ingots across deserts, through mountain passes, and over unpredictable seas, all while maintaining fragile diplomatic peace with every territory in between. This was the hidden, beating heart of the Bronze Age world, a pulse of essential material flowing along invisible veins. The splendor of the palaces, the authority of the elite, the very security of the state, all depended on this uninterrupted flow. Then the veins were cut. As drought sparked famine and migrations turned to raids, those long, delicate trade routes became impossible to maintain. Caravans were ambushed. Ports were sacked or closed. The kings who were once brothers in diplomacy became preoccupied with their own survival, no longer honoring treaties to send vital materials. The result was not just an economic downturn, it was a technological cliff. Tin shipments simply stopped arriving. Imagine the master bronze smith in the workshop of a great city. For generations, his family's craft defined their worth. He knows the perfect temperature to heat the furnace, the exact ratio of copper to tin, the art of pouring the molten metal into molds for swords, tools, and ceremonial vessels. One day, the royal overseer arrives with grim news. The tin is gone. There will be no more shipments. The smith's profound skill, the very knowledge that upholds the kingdom's military and cultural identity, is instantly rendered useless. He stares at his furnace, his molds, his stockpile of copper, and realizes he can make nothing of value. This was not a minor shortage. It was a systemic failure that struck at the core of how these societies functioned. Bronze was not just for war, it was for administration, the chisels and styluses used by scribes, the tools for carpentry and shipbuilding, the very implements that maintained the infrastructure of civilization. A king without bronze could not re-arm his soldiers after a battle. He could not reward his loyal commanders with ceremonial gifts. He could not even ensure his scribes had the tools to record his deeds, eroding the administrative memory of the state itself. The bronze shortage hypothesis suggests a powerful domino effect. As the alloy became scarce, the elite's ability to project power and maintain social order evaporated. The magnificent chariots sat idle, their fittings broken with no means of repair. The warrior's armor grew patchwork and was passed down until it was more memory than metal. The state, built on a promise of protection and provision through superior technology, could no longer keep that promise. Its authority, literally forged in bronze, began to crumble into rust. In this light, the abandonment of the great cities appears not as a sudden invasion, but as a slow, grinding disarmament. A society that had built its identity around a material it could no longer acquire was left fundamentally disoriented, vulnerable not just to enemies but to a crippling loss of purpose. The silence that followed in places like Hattusa may have been the sound of a civilization realizing it had run out of the one thing it could not replace, the very ingredient of its own power. The grand palaces left behind a profound silence. In the centuries following the collapse, the archaeological record across Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant undergoes a remarkable transformation, one that speaks not of conquest but of a collective, conscious choice. The monumental architecture, the intricate frescoes depicting gods and kings, the vast storehouses and administrative quarters all vanish. The flow of luxury goods, the carved ivories, the gold signet rings, and the fine painted pottery from distant lands dries up completely. Most tellingly, the written word itself disappears from daily life. The linear B script of the Mycenaeans, the cuneiform of the Hittites, the unique alphabet of Ugarit, these complex systems of record-keeping and royal propaganda fall out of use. This is not a temporary setback, it is a wholesale simplification of society. What emerges from the ashes is a world of villages, smaller settlements, often in new, more defensible locations, focused on the basics of survival. Their material culture is plainer, their tools more utilitarian, their economies oriented toward local subsistence farming, herding, and small-scale craft production. This shift is so dramatic that archaeologists once called the following centuries a dark age, but that term misses the point. This was not a step backward into ignorance, but a strategic step sideways into resilience. It was a societal survival mechanism, a voluntary shedding of complexity that had become a lethal burden. The great cities that fell were prisoners of their own grandeur. Their entire identity, their social hierarchy, their economic logic was built upon and expressed through that complexity. The king was not just a leader, he was the apex of a pyramid that required scribes, soldiers, artisans, and merchants to function. To abandon the palace was to abandon the very idea of the state itself. They were physically and psychologically incapable of simplifying because their survival was synonymous with the system. Asking Hattusa to become a village was like asking a majestic eagle to live its life as a sparrow, a biological and existential impossibility. The communities that endured, however, were either already structured like villages or possessed the social flexibility to make that transition. The highland settlements in the Levant, the refocused towns on Cyprus, even the Phoenician ports with their pragmatic, trade-based alliances, all operated on a scale that could contract without shattering. Their power was not concentrated in a single, vulnerable citadel, but distributed across kinship groups and local elders. When crisis hit, they could downsize. They could stop building temples and start reinforcing food storage pits. They could let the art of writing fade because their daily transactions no longer required vast bureaucratic records. They traded the wide, vulnerable network for the tight, strong knot. This simplification was a form of societal adaptation, a return to fundamentals when the advanced model failed. It was a quiet, widespread acknowledgement that in this new, harsher world, survival was more important than splendor, and community more vital than a crown. The silence that followed the Bronze Age collapse, then, is not the silence of death, but the focused quiet of a people listening to a different rhythm, the steady, essential pulse of the village, the field, and the hearth. Geography was a quiet architect of survival. The great capitals that fell, from Hattusa to Mycenae, were often built on open plains or along major coastal highways, their locations chosen for trade, agriculture, and the projection of power. These were the central nodes of the network, places designed for connection and wealth. But when the network itself became the source of danger, those very locations turned into traps. The cities that endured the collapse frequently shared a different kind of address. They were not at the center of things, but on the margins, and in that marginality, they found a profound strategic advantage. Look at the early Israelite settlements beginning to form in the central highlands of Canaan during this period. These were not grand cities on plains, but small villages perched on rocky hilltops, often surrounded by terraced fields carved into the slopes. Their location was not chosen for easy access to international caravans, but for security and local self-sufficiency. a hilltop village is naturally defensible, giving its inhabitants a clear view of approaching threats. The terraced farming, while labor-intensive, captured precious rainwater and allowed for a diversified agriculture of olives, grapes, and grains, making them less vulnerable to the failure of a single crop. Their economy was inward-looking, built on what the local community and its immediate neighbors could produce and exchange. They were not waiting for a shipment of tin from Afghanistan or a diplomatic gift of ivory from Egypt. Their survival was not tied to the health of distant kings. This pattern repeats elsewhere. The Phoenician cities, as we saw, were often on coastal promontories or islands, their connection to the sea a source of mobility rather than a fixed target. Assyria's heartland, while fertile, was buffered by distance from the epicenters of coastal chaos. These were places that could, if necessary, pull up the drawbridge and rely on their own immediate resources for a time. They existed in the spaces between the great powers, and when those powers evaporated, the spaces remained. In contrast, a city like Ugarit was the definition of a central node. It sat on a flat, fertile coastal plain at the crossroads of major land and sea routes. This made it unimaginably wealthy in a connected world, but hopelessly exposed in a fractured one. It had no defensible high ground to retreat to, and its entire reason for existence vanished when the caravans stopped and the ships became hostile. Its wealth was its beacon, and in the gathering storm, that beacon attracted lightning. The advantage, then, was not merely in being remote, but in possessing a geography that enabled resilience. A hill country settlement could see trouble coming and had time to prepare. An island city could control access. A region with reliable local rainfall could still feed itself when trade failed. The Great Plains and open ports, for all their bounty, offered none of these buffers. They were optimized for prosperity in a stable system, not for endurance in a collapsing one. Their very success had made them soft targets, dependent on a web of connections that, when torn, left them utterly stranded. The survivors understood, whether by choice or by circumstance, that in a time of unraveling, sometimes the safest place to be is not at the center of the tapestry, but along its stronger, simpler edges. A king's authority was carved not just in stone, but in the stars. Across the Bronze Age world, from the pharaohs of Egypt to the lords of Mycenae, rulers did not merely govern. They served as the vital link between the human realm and the divine. They were often seen as gods themselves, or as the chief priests whose rituals guaranteed the fertility of the land, the regularity of the seasons, and the favor of the heavens. This was the powerful ideology of divine kingship, the invisible mortar that held the entire social pyramid together. It explained why one man commanded absolute obedience, why farmers surrendered their surplus grain, and why soldiers marched to distant battles. The system functioned beautifully as long as the cosmic contract seemed intact, as long as the rains came, the harvests were plentiful, and enemies were kept at bay. But what happens when the gods appear to break their promise? The prolonged drought that gripped the region was more than an environmental disaster, it was a theological crisis. If the king was a god or the god's chosen representative, why were the skies empty and the fields turning to dust? The famine that followed was not just a physical hardship, it was a direct challenge to the ruler's divine mandate. His most fundamental duty was to ensure the well-being of his people, to be the guarantor of life itself. When the palace storehouses ran low and the redistributive economy faltered, that guarantee was revealed as hollow. The ideological foundation of the state, which had seemed as solid as the mountains, began to crack and crumble from within. This loss of faith was perhaps more devastating than any invading army. A soldier might question why he should risk his life for a king whose gods have abandoned him. A farmer might wonder why he should give his last measure of grain to a distant palace that can offer no protection in return. The social cohesion that bound thousands together in a complex hierarchy dissolved into a collection of individuals and families concerned solely with immediate survival. In this atmosphere of broken trust, the grand narratives of empire lost their power. The magnificent temples and royal inscriptions now seemed like monuments to a failed covenant. This ideological collapse made the physical abandonment of cities not just practical but almost inevitable. Why remain loyal to a hollow crown, to a spiritual authority that could not deliver the most basic blessings? In contrast, smaller, kinship-based societies weathered this ideological storm far better. Their leaders were not distant gods, but elders, chieftains, or heads of families, figures whose authority was based on direct personal relationships and proven ability. Their connection to the divine was often more localized, tied to ancestral spirits or village deities, a belief system that was less vulnerable to the failure of broad, state-sponsored cosmic order. When times grew hard, the bond of family and clan could tighten, fostering shared sacrifice and mutual aid. Their social contract was simpler, more tangible, and therefore more resilient in the face of cosmic doubt. The great empires were brought low not only by sword and drought, but by a silent mass realization, a collective sigh of lost faith that emptied their palaces as surely as any siege. No single disaster could have erased an entire world. The true power of the Bronze Age collapse lies in its terrifying synergy, a cascade of interlocking failures where each problem amplified the next, creating a feedback loop that no society of the time could possibly control. It began with a whisper from the climate, a prolonged and severe drought that parched the very fields that fed empires. This was not merely a bad season, but a decades-long shift that placed an unbearable strain on agricultural systems designed for abundance. As harvests failed, the foundational promise of the state to provide food and security began to crack. Famine is more than hunger, it is a social solvent. It dissolves loyalty and frays the bonds between ruler and ruled. A king who cannot fill the granaries loses his divine mandate, his authority seeping away like water into dry earth. This internal weakening was the first critical fracture in the complex architecture of these civilizations. With states weakened from within, their ability to project power and maintain order faltered. This created openings on two devastating fronts. Internally, local elites and suffering populations grew restless, sparking revolts and a loss of central control. Externally, the great trade networks that were the lifeblood of the age, the veins carrying tin, copper, and luxury goods, became vulnerable. As royal authority receded, the protection for caravans and ships vanished. Trade routes frayed and then snapped, creating a second catastrophic blow, a technological and economic cliff. Without tin, bronze production halted. Without bronze, armies could not be rearmed, tools could not be repaired, and the material symbol of elite power literally vanished. The state's capacity to respond to crisis was now crippled by the very crisis it faced. This combination of famine and failing trade set a third terrible force in motion: human migration. Desperate communities, their homelands turning to dust and their local rulers powerless, gathered their families and possessions to search for survival. These streams of displaced people, what the Egyptian records would call the Sea Peoples, flowed toward the remaining centers of wealth along the coasts and fertile valleys. To a starving, mobile population, a wealthy port city was not a neighbor but a source of sustenance. Their movement was not an invasion in the traditional sense, but a desperate surge that overwhelmed the logistical and social capacity of the states in its path. A weakened kingdom, already struggling to feed its own people, had no mechanism to absorb thousands of newcomers. The result was inevitable conflict, but that conflict further disrupted agriculture and trade, intensifying the famine that had sparked the migrations in the first place. Each element fed the others in a vicious, accelerating cycle. Drought caused famine, which sparked revolt and disrupted trade, which spurred migrations, which led to more conflict and further disruption, until the entire interconnected system was spinning toward breakdown. This is why the great, complex cities were abandoned while some settlements survived. A highly centralized state, like a mighty oak, draws strength from a deep, wide network of roots. But when a sustained storm attacks both its branches and severs its roots simultaneously, the entire tree can fall. A smaller, more flexible society, like a patch of reeds or grasses, might bend and lose some shoots, but its interconnected root system is shallow and local, allowing it to weather the same storm. The collapse was a perfect storm of climate, economy, and human movement, a demonstration that civilization is not a monument but a dynamic balance. When too many stresses converge on a system that cannot adapt quickly, the result is not a slow decline but a rapid, overwhelming failure. The silent cities left behind are not tombs of a defeated people, but classrooms of stone, teaching us about the fragile, interwoven threads that hold a world together, and how quickly they can unravel when they pull against each other. The most advanced cities were often the first to fall silent. Think of the Bronze Age world not as a collection of independent kingdoms, but as an ancient, sprawling power grid. This grid connected palaces, ports, and workshops across continents, humming with the energy of trade, communication, and specialized labor. The greatest cities like Hattusa, Mycenae, and Ugarit were not just places, they were the primary power stations, the massive transformers that took in raw resources from distant lands and converted them into the cultural and military electricity of civilization. They shone the brightest, but their brilliance came with a profound vulnerability. They were entirely dependent on that grid. Every component of their existence, from the tin in a smith's workshop to the grain in the royal storehouse, arrived via long, delicate transmission lines that stretched across mountains and seas. When the grid was healthy, these cities were miracles of human achievement. But when the first major disruption hit, a climatic drought that strained the entire system, these complex nodes were the most exposed. They had no local backup generator. Their entire design was about output, not resilience. The intricate web of dependencies that defined their glory became a web of fatal connections in a crisis. A drought in Anatolia meant less grain for the Hittite capital. A raid on a Cypriot port meant no copper for Mycenaean weapons. A diplomatic breakdown meant no tin shipments to any of them. Each failure cascaded through the network, and the biggest consumers of power went dark first. Their specialization, which had made them wealthy, now made them fragile. A bronze smith could not suddenly become a subsistence farmer. A scribe trained in Linear B had no use for his skills in a village that kept no royal accounts. The high overhead of maintaining a chariot corps, a royal bureaucracy, and monumental architecture became an unbearable weight when the resources to fuel it stopped flowing. They were optimized for a world of abundance and stability, and could not reconfigure for a world of scarcity and shock. Meanwhile, the settlements that survived were like small towns with their own local generators. They were not plugged into the main grid with the same intensity. Their economies were more diversified, based on herding, local crafts, and farming a mix of crops suited to their immediate environment. They might trade, but they did not depend on a single imported material for their core identity or security. Their social structures were often flatter, organized around kinship and local elders rather than a distant, god-like king whose legitimacy was evaporating with the failing reign. When the great grid failed and the mega-cities went dark, these communities simply switched to their own power source. They tightened their circles, relied on what they could make and grow locally, and hunkered down in their defensible hilltops or behind their coastal walls. They traded the dazzling but vulnerable light of a central power station for the steady, reliable glow of a lantern. This is the ultimate lesson written in the dust of those abandoned cities. In the long run, complexity is not a guarantee of success. It is a calculation of risk. the most magnificent achievements of a society can become its heaviest anchors, tethering it to a single version of the world that may not last. The survivors understood, either by wisdom or by necessity, that true endurance often lies not in building the biggest transformer, but in keeping a simpler flame alive. A city's final chapter is written in the layers of earth left behind. When archaeologists carefully peel back these layers, they are not just looking for grand treasures, but for subtle, telling clues that distinguish a sudden, violent end from a slow, deliberate departure. The evidence tells two very different stories, and each reveals a distinct fate for the societies of the Bronze Age. At the Hittite capital of Hattusa, the story is one of eerie order. There is no widespread layer of ash, no heaps of shattered weapons from a last stand. Instead, the massive city gates were found sealed from the inside. The royal archives, thousands of clay tablets containing the empire's laws and diplomatic correspondence, were neatly stored in their rooms, as if waiting for a scribe who never returned. The grain silos were empty, not burned. This pattern points not to conquest but to a planned exodus. The people gathered what they could carry and left, closing the doors on a home that could no longer sustain them. It was an abandonment born of systemic failure, a quiet acknowledgement that the city itself had become a burden. A starkly different scene emerges at the Mycenaean palace of Pylos in Greece. Here, fire swept through the administrative heart of the complex. In the heat of that blaze, clay tablets inscribed with the Linear B script were accidentally baked hard, preserving them for millennia. These tablets were not stored away, they were in active use, recording mundane details like the allocation of bronze to smiths and the deployment of rowers for coastal watch. Their context is crucial. They were found amidst the destruction, capturing a kingdom in its final, functioning moments before catastrophe struck. This is evidence of a violent and sudden interruption, a disaster that arrived while the bureaucratic machine was still turning. The contrast is profound. One city closed its doors and walked away. Another was caught in the act of daily life and consumed. Beyond these dramatic moments, archaeologists trace abandonment through slower, quieter signatures. One of the most telling is the sudden cessation of a distinctive pottery style. In a thriving city, pottery evolves, new decorative motifs appear, and techniques improve. When a site is permanently abandoned, that local style simply stops. No new pots with its unique patterns are made anywhere. It becomes a fossil in the archaeological record, a cultural heartbeat that flatlines at a specific point in time. Furthermore, nature quickly reclaims a vacant space. Without feet to tread them and hands to clean them, streets begin to fill with wind-blown silt and debris. Roofs collapse and the rubble from walls slowly accumulates, creating a sterile layer that seals the last moment of habitation. In a functioning town, even a poor one, such accumulation is constantly cleared away. In an abandoned one, it settles like a gentle, dusty shroud. Now, compare this to the archaeological record at a known survivor site. Take a highland village in the Levant that continued through the collapse. Here, the pottery styles do not vanish, they gradually change, showing adaptation and continuity. The layers of occupation show no sterile silt filling the streets. Instead, there are sequences of compacted floors, rebuilt walls, and new hearths laid over old ones. There might be evidence of hardship, perhaps a period where buildings were smaller or goods were plainer, but there is no clean break. The story is one of persistence, of a community hunkering down, simplifying its life, but never leaving. It is the difference between a clock that has stopped and one that has merely slowed, its hands still moving, marking the passage of a difficult but enduring time. These physical clues in the dirt are the ultimate testimony, proving that the end of the Bronze Age was not one event, but a mosaic of countless human decisions, from the orderly retreat to the desperate last stand to the stubborn, quiet refusal to disappear. The same empire could produce two entirely different endings. Within the crumbling Hittite world, the fates of its capital, Hattusa, and one of its most important vassal cities, Carchemish, offer a perfect microcosm of the Great Collapse. Their contrasting stories, separated by only a few hundred miles, reveal how geography and adaptability could mean the difference between extinction and endurance. Hattusa, as we have seen, was a magnificent inland fortress, a political and religious heart utterly dependent on the empire's centralized systems. When those systems failed, the heart stopped beating, and the city was left in silent, orderly ruin. But look southeast to a great bend in the mighty Euphrates River. Here sat Carchemish, a bustling commercial hub and a key Hittite administrative center. It faced the same drought, the same imperial unraveling, and the same waves of disruption. Yet Carchemish did not vanish. Instead, it transformed, becoming a vibrant, independent Neo-Hittite city-state that thrived for centuries after the empire's fall. Why did one city become a ghost while the other became a phoenix? The answer is written in water and in welcome. Carchemish's greatest advantage was its lifeblood, the Euphrates River. While Hattusa's Anatolian plateau relied on uncertain rains and vulnerable overland supply lines, Carchemish was anchored to a permanent, predictable source of water. Even in times of drought, the great river continued to flow, supporting irrigation for fields and providing a reliable channel for transportation. This riverine location was not just about survival, it was about continuity. Carchemish sat astride one of the most critical trade routes in the ancient world, connecting Anatolia to Mesopotamia and the Levant. When the old imperial trade networks managed from Hattusa collapsed, the fundamental geography of trade did not. Merchants still needed to move goods, and the Euphrates corridor remained the logical path. Carchemish, as a river port and crossroads, could facilitate this new, more localized commerce long after the capital's bureaucrats had sealed their archives and departed. Its economy could adapt because its geographic reason for being never went away. But Carchemish did something even more crucial: it opened its gates. As chaos engulfed the Hittite hinterlands, Carchemish likely became a beacon for refugees, including perhaps members of the Hittite royal family and elite. Instead of seeing these displaced populations as a burden that would overwhelm its resources, as the rigid systems of the great capitals might have, Carchemish appears to have absorbed them. This influx was not a catastrophe, it was an infusion. It brought new people, skills, and perhaps even a renewed sense of Hittite identity, now divorced from the failing central state. The city became a reservoir of Hittite culture, language, and traditions, preserving them in a new form. This ability to integrate rather than exclude was a hallmark of resilience. Finally, Carchemish mastered the art of the new alliance. No longer bound by loyalty to a distant, defunct capital, the city's leaders forged pragmatic relationships with their neighbors, including the emerging Aramean groups and other surviving city-states. They blended Hittite artistic styles with local influences, creating a distinctive Neo-Hittite culture. They governed not as imperial viceroys, but as independent kings of a powerful river city. Carchemish traded the brittle, top-down authority of the empire for a more flexible, networked form of power. It understood that in a fragmented world, strength came from connection and mutual interest, not from imperial command. So, within the same collapsing civilization, we see the two paths laid bare. Hattusa represented the old model, a brilliant but brittle central processor that could not function once the network failed. Carchemish represented the new, a resilient node that could run on local power, absorb new inputs, and rewrite its own programming. One was a monument to a lost ideal, the other was a living bridge to the future. The silence that settled over the ruins was not empty, it was a field lying fallow. In the regions most shattered by the collapse, like mainland Greece and central Anatolia, the centuries that followed were marked by a profound simplification of life. Populations plummeted, with estimates suggesting a decline of up to 90% in some areas. The grand, interconnected world receded into isolated village clusters. The most telling loss was that of writing. The linear B script of the Mycenaeans and the cuneiform of the Hittites vanished from daily use, not out of ignorance, but because the complex bureaucracies that required them were gone. For generations, memory and law were passed down orally, and history became legend. This period, often called a Dark Age, was less a time of barbarism and more a long, necessary convalescence, a society recovering from a systemic shock by returning to its most basic rhythms. Yet, even in this quiet, seeds were quietly germinating. From the ashes of the old order, entirely new forms of political and cultural life began to stir, shaped by the hard lessons of collapse. Along the Levantine coast, the Phoenician cities, having survived by their wits and their ships, performed one of history's greatest acts of intellectual distillation. They took the complex, cumbersome writing systems of the Bronze Age and streamlined them into an alphabet of about 24 symbols, each representing a sound. This was a revolution in portable knowledge. It was no longer the exclusive tool of palace scribes, but a system accessible to merchants tracking cargo or families marking possessions. This Phoenician alphabet would travel across the Mediterranean, adapted by the Greeks and eventually forming the basis of our own, a direct legacy of a society that prized practical communication over monumental record-keeping. In the same landscape, two new power groups defined themselves in the wake of the imperial vacuum. In the central highlands of Canaan, a collection of tribes forged a new identity and a new form of social covenant, emerging as the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Their stories, later compiled into the Hebrew Bible, are deeply rooted in narratives of exodus, covenant, and resilience, themes that resonate powerfully with the experience of surviving a fallen world. On the coastal plain, the Philistines, likely descended from some of those very sea peoples, established a pentapolis of powerful city-states, introducing new architectural styles, pottery, and military technologies. Their constant friction and interaction with their highland neighbors would shape the region's history for centuries, and in the east, the Assyrians, having held their core together, became the librarians of the Old World. In their great cities like Nineveh, kings would later amass vast clay tablet libraries, deliberately preserving the myths, medical texts, and royal annals of the very Mesopotamian and Syrian cultures that had crumbled around them. They understood that knowledge itself was a form of power, and in safeguarding these fragments, they kept the flame of Bronze Age civilization flickering, ready to inform the empires of the Iron Age. The Great Collapse, therefore, was not an end, but a brutal and necessary filter. It cleared away rigid, over-centralized political forms that could not adapt, making space for experiments in cooperation, identity, and governance. The world that emerged was leaner, harder, and more diverse, a patchwork of smaller states and confederacies born from the understanding that survival depended on flexibility, literacy, and the strength of local bonds. The shadow of the collapse was long, but it was in that shadow that the roots of our own world began to quietly take hold. The story of the collapse is still being written in laboratories and satellite data. For all we have uncovered, the Bronze Age's end remains a frontier of historical mystery, its details fiercely debated by scholars who piece together the past from fragments. Take the Sea Peoples, that catalyst of chaos. Their precise origins are a puzzle. Were they a coalition from specific, failing kingdoms in the Aegean and Anatolia, or a more diverse confederation drawn from across the Mediterranean? Ancient Egyptian inscriptions name them but offer no map to their homelands. This debate matters because it changes our understanding of the collapse's momentum. Was it a domino effect of specific regional failures, or a broader, simultaneous unraveling that pushed many peoples to sea at once? Even the climate story, now supported by strong evidence, has its nuances. The mega-drought was likely severe, but was it uniform? Emerging research suggests its impact may have been patchwork, devastating some areas while sparing others, which could explain why some cities found just enough resilience to cling on while their neighbors were utterly consumed. Some researchers point to another potential stressor woven into this already tense period: seismic activity. The eastern Mediterranean sits on a geologically active zone, and evidence of major earthquakes has been found at several sites dating to this era. A powerful quake could have shattered a city's walls and water systems in an instant, a physical blow that a society already struggling with famine and unrest might not recover from. Perhaps most intriguing is the question of speed. The archaeological record shows a sharp break, but was the collapse as sudden as it appears from a distance? New techniques are allowing us to zoom in on those critical decades. Isotope analysis of ancient teeth and bones can now trace an individual's diet and even their geographic movement over a lifetime, telling us if a city's population was eating local grain or imported food right before its end. Advanced climate models can simulate ancient weather patterns with greater precision, helping us see the drought not as a single event, but as a series of punishing waves. And from the sky, LIDAR surveys are revealing the true scope of ancient settlements, uncovering networks of roads, farms, and smaller villages that traditional archaeology might miss, giving us a fuller picture of how societies were organized and where people might have gone when the cities emptied. Each of these tools is like a new lens on an old portrait, revealing subtle brushstrokes and shadows we never saw before. They remind us that history is not a solved case, but an ongoing conversation between the past and our ever-improving ability to listen. The silence of the abandoned cities is not absolute, it is simply waiting for the right question. These silent stones hold a final, unifying truth. The great cities were not abandoned because they were weak, but because they were brilliantly, fatally complex. Their end was a selective filter, a historical process that did not punish poverty or ignorance, but instead exposed a specific kind of fragility. Survival in that age of unraveling was not a matter of chance alone, but a reward for a particular set of traits. It favored those blessed with geographic luck, a reliable river or a defensible hill that provided a buffer against the chaos. It favored communities built on economic and social adaptability, who could trade across the sea one season and rely on their own terraced fields the next. Most of all, it favored simpler, more resilient structures, where power was distributed and identity was rooted in kinship rather than in a single, vulnerable palace. The glittering networks of the Bronze Age, for all their achievement, created civilizations that were like intricate crystal goblets, magnificent to behold but shattering under the right kind of pressure. The villages and pragmatic port towns that endured were more like sturdy clay cups, less impressive perhaps, but far harder to break. This is the collapse's enduring lesson, a reminder that interconnection and specialization are double-edged swords. They can create wonders and concentrate wealth at a dizzying speed, but they also weave a web of dependencies where a break in one strand can make the entire pattern disintegrate. It asks us to look at our own world, at our just-in-time supply chains, our digital networks, and our globalized systems of finance and food. We live in an age of unprecedented connection, a modern tapestry far more vast and intricate than anything the Hittite kings could have dreamed of. The story of these ancient cities does not predict our future, but it does offer a sobering mirror. It invites us to consider where our own vulnerabilities might lie, which threads in our own global web are most delicate, and what forms of resilience we are building for an uncertain tomorrow. The past does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes, and the echoes from those abandoned cities are still faintly audible if we choose to listen.